What if I told you that in the summer of 1846 an entire convent sealed itself away, and when its doors finally moved again, they weren't made of wood, they were made of flesh? This is not just another ghost story. This is a true horror story, buried in America's haunted history. A forbidden chapter from a forgotten town called Breach Hollow, where silence itself became a ritual and memory turned into a living, breathing thing. On paper, Breach Hollow was a quiet place. Limestone hills rising behind a market square where people traded bread, milk, and news. But beneath those stones pulsed an older rhythm, a hum that no priest could sanctify, no prayer could silence. It all began when the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy women, known for their perfect silence and identical black habits, vanished behind their convent gates without warning, leaving a town trapped in dread and unsolved mystery. The convent bell, once the heartbeat of dawn, fell silent after the Feast of Magdalene, and from that silence spilled visions of strange birds perched motionless for days, doors that seemed to breathe, and children waking up speaking words from scriptures no one ever taught them. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. The townspeople began to rot from the inside out. Not just crops, not just animals, but faith itself, and as weeks bled into months, the chapel door pulsed like a wound that remembered every secret ever whispered. This is a disturbing documentary not about ghosts, but about cosmic horror lurking in real haunted places. A forbidden cult whose worship was silence and whose prayers were made of numbers and breath. Stay with me, because Breach Hollow didn't disappear, it only remembered. And the remembering has just begun. In the summer of 1846, Breach Hollow awoke to a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the sky. A silence that didn't feel empty but full, like the moment before a word you're too afraid to speak. The Sisters of Perpetual Mercy, women whose black habits moved like a single ripple of night, had vanished behind their convent doors, and the town felt that absence like a lung refusing to breathe. For decades, these nuns had been part of Breach Hollow's daily rhythm, their quiet presence as reliable as dawn. The soft shuffle of their feet across limestone steps, the gentle tilt of their heads when townsfolk passed. They were known for a silence so profound it seemed almost holy, for voices that carried one single tone, as if molded from the same breath. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their words fell like stones into deep water, leaving ripples of unease. Mother Galilea, the woman who led them, carried eyes the color of cooled ash and a gaze that never blinked. Not even in the white glare of winter sun. Children would turn away when she smiled, not because she was cruel, but because behind her ribs seemed to live something older than memory itself. And yet, the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy were nothing if not predictable. They'd taken retreats before, silent fasts in the convent's stone belly, but never without warning the town, never without leaving lists for the grocer's boy, or small folded notes for the butcher's wife explaining the absence. That summer, no such notes appeared. The convent gates remained shut, the iron archway at the base of the hill locked without explanation. At night, the chapel windows, which once spilled gold and crimson candlelight into the trees, lay dark, as if something inside was holding its breath. The convent bell, which used to ring every morning at precisely 6, ceased altogether after the Feast of Magdalene, and in a place where routine was religion, its silence became a wound the whole town felt. This is not simply a haunted history. This is a true horror story, a piece of forbidden cult lore that history never wanted you to hear, a cosmic horror lurking in a real haunted place, a disturbing documentary etched into the stone of a forgotten town. People tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. The blacksmith hammered horseshoes into perfect arcs. The baker dusted flour across the same wooden table he'd used for 20 years. Children chased each other across the market square, though they glanced often toward the hill, where the convent loomed above like an unblinking eye. But underneath these rituals pulsed a quiet terror, the unsolved mystery of an entire convent simply ceasing to exist in the daylight. And when the carpenter was sent to repair a pew inside the chapel, he knocked 3 times on the oak doors, then, once more out of habit, and received no answer. It was then that the townsfolk first noticed how heavy the air had become, thick with pollen, the bees moving sluggish as though wading through syrup, and how the silence seemed to deepen under the weight of something waiting. Because true horror doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives as absence, as breath withheld, as the knowledge that the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy, so devoted to routine, had chosen this silence without a single word left behind. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. And the town of Breach Hollow, though they didn't know it yet, stood on the edge of a reality about to come undone. This is the story of that unraveling a terrifying true event hidden beneath centuries of limestone and whispered only in shadows. A story that proves memory isn't history. It's a practice. And in Breach Hollow, that practice was just beginning. They say true horror doesn't arrive with screams, but with silence so deep it begins to hum in your bones. And in Breach Hollow, that silence began at the convent gates. After the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy failed to appear in the market for days, the first man sent to investigate was a carpenter, a man whose hands were steady with chisels but trembling with secrets he'd never admit. He climbed the path to the convent alone, the limestone ridge pressing around him like the walls of a crypt, and when he reached the stone archway at the convent's base, he knocked 3 times, then once more out of habit, but no one answered. In that moment, he realized the town's greatest unsolved mystery wasn't simply that the sisters were missing, it was that they were choosing to remain silent. The convent gates were shut so tightly not even the pollen-laden wind could slip between their iron bars. And behind those gates, the windows stayed dark. No flicker of candlelight tracing stained glass panes of crimson and gold. This wasn't just a closed door. It was the birth of a forbidden cult of silence, a cosmic horror waiting to reveal itself. The carpenter, driven by a mix of dread and duty, pressed his ear to the thick oak door, half expecting the familiar hush of prayer, or the gentle rustle of habits in motion. Instead, he heard nothing at all. Not even the faint echo of breath, as though the entire chapel had forgotten how to exhale. The road back down felt longer than the climb, and when he returned to town, his eyes were glassy, his voice softer than sawdust. It wasn't that he'd heard something. It was that he'd heard absolutely nothing. And in Breach Hollow, silence was never empty. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to spin theories as fast as gossip could travel. Perhaps the sisters were fasting, or perhaps they'd taken a vow deeper than any known to Scripture. But as the days stretched on, doubt turned to dread, and people whispered about a haunted convent harboring unspeakable secrets. A true horror story hidden within America's haunted places, where the divine and the damned intersected. The stone archway of the convent became a symbol of unsolved mystery, drawing cautious glances from grocers and traders alike, each too afraid to try the gates themselves. Because in Breach Hollow, the problem wasn't that the convent was locked, it was that it felt like it was locking something in. Even the wind shifted around the hill differently now, carrying a sharp, bitter scent like burnt myrrh and old pages, as if the convent's stones themselves were exhaling forbidden scriptures. The townsfolk noticed the birds, 2 gray-feathered, unmoving, perched like sentinels along the chapel steeple, their eyes fixed on the east-facing stained glass, as if waiting for something to rise behind it. And though the carpenter was the first to test the convent door, he would not be the last. Rumors spread quickly that a priest might have better luck, or that perhaps the sisters would respond to Latin prayers. But each idea collapsed under the weight of one undeniable fact: the chapel door could only be locked from within. That detail haunted the town, because it meant someone or something was still inside. The silence became an entity all its own, slithering between conversations, tightening around throats when questions grew too specific. Children were told to stay away from the chapel hill, and even the dogs refused to climb the slope, barking into the mist as though seeing figures that human eyes could not. Merchants began leaving parcels at the base of the hill instead of approaching the gates, hurling packages as though fearing what might answer if they lingered. The town square, once echoing with the clang of blacksmiths and laughter of market-goers, now felt draped in a quiet too heavy for daylight. It was as though Breach Hollow itself was waiting for the door to open, or for something older to step out through the wood that was no longer merely wood. And in the hush, one truth crawled through every whispered theory and half-remembered hymn. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. It fell to Father Rena, the town's spiritual anchor, and the man who had baptized every sister in the convent, to climb the chapel hill himself. For in Breach Hollow, there was a silent agreement that when true horror finally presses close enough to stain the stones, it is the clergy who must go first. He ascended the path at dawn, rosary clenched so tightly that when he finally opened his palm, the beads had left bruises shaped like small moons. The wind was thick with pollen and hung heavy with a quiet that felt almost physical, pressing against his chest as though resisting his approach. The sun climbed behind him but could not pierce the shadows pooling around the convent's limestone walls, and the silence seemed to hum with a frequency just below hearing, as though memory itself was reciting forbidden prayers no human ear was meant to hear. He found the bell rope stiff with dust, its frayed end unmoved since the Feast of Magdalene, and each step closer to the chapel door felt like crossing into a place where time no longer belonged to clocks. Father Rena knocked gently at first, then harder, his hand flat against the thick oak, but the door remained as indifferent as bone. He called out in Latin, invoking prayers he had used since his earliest days in the seminary, his voice echoing off the stone like the last cry of a drowning man. But the convent did not answer. He circled the building, found every shutter bolted, every crack sealed with wax, the convent drawn shut as tight as a wound, and then he saw at the smallest window above the prayer room, uncovered and stained with glass, the color of dried blood and tarnished gold. It was there that Father Rena paused, took 2 trembling steps backward, and looked inside. What he saw should have been a vision of holiness. 14 figures kneeling in silent devotion, veils drawn low over faces bowed toward the altar. But one figure turned her head not toward him, but toward something unseen behind her, and in that fractional movement lay a terror deeper than any demon's claw. Because in Breach Hollow, it was never the movement itself that terrified people. It was what might be looking back from the other side of the veil, and as Father Rena watched, all at once, every candle in the chapel went out, snuffed in perfect synchronicity as though the darkness itself had been commanded to kneel. For one heartbeat, Father Rena felt certain the figures had not moved at all, that perhaps it was simply a trick of the glass. But then the silence shifted, thickened, became a weight on his tongue as though memory had begun to settle inside his throat. He stumbled backward down the slope, the rosary beads still trembling in his grasp. And when he reached the bottom of the hill, he found himself speaking fragments of scripture that did not exist. Verses twisted into shapes no Bible had ever claimed. It wasn't merely that the sisters were praying. It was that they seemed to be waiting for a command older than God. Word of Father Rena's vision spread through Breach Hollow like blood seeping into linen, each retelling darker than the last. Townsfolk gathered in whispers, eyes darting toward the chapel hill, as though afraid that even speaking the convent's name aloud might summon something with ears pressed close against the inside of that door. The blacksmith claimed the hill was breathing. The baker's wife said she dreamed of veiled women counting backward from 14. Children stopped laughing near the chapel path, and animals pulled at their leads as if trying to escape, not a building but an idea. And in the days that followed, an unspoken truth calcified in Breach Hollow's marrow. The door wasn't locked to keep the world out. It was locked to keep something in. In Breach Hollow, The terror did not descend like a sudden storm. It arrived as a gradual infection, spreading first through the air, then through the eyes of those who dared to look too long toward the convent on the hill. It began with the birds. They appeared in dozens at first, perched silent and immobile along the steeple of the chapel. Neither crows nor sparrows, but some gray-feathered species that no one in town could name. They did not flutter, did not sing, only stared unblinking toward the stained glass window facing east, as if waiting for something to rise behind it. The gravedigger's boy was the first to notice, and he told his father that the birds' eyes seemed to follow him wherever he walked, but his father only shrugged, lit his pipe, and called it nonsense, a small act of denial that would become the entire town's daily ritual in the weeks to come. Because in Breach Hollow, it was always easier to pretend that horror belonged to stories, not to the stones beneath your own feet. By dusk, the birds had not flown, and by morning, their numbers had doubled. People whispered that this was no ordinary haunting, that the convent hill had become a threshold between the town and some cosmic horror too vast to name. It was the first true sign that the silence within the convent was not mere absence. It was the presence of something watching back. Merchants delivering flour or salted meat began leaving their goods at the base of the hill instead of carrying them to the convent door. Even the grocer's boy, once fearless and spry, refused to climb the slope, insisting he felt a cold weight pressing against his chest each time he tried to step forward. And those who did ascend the path said the wind was different up there still, dense, as though the air itself had grown heavy with secrets. Some reported catching faint glimpses of figures moving behind the chapel's stained glass, but when asked to describe what they saw, their words always collapsed into trembling silence. The presence of the birds, meanwhile, became a dark punctuation to each day's rising dread. People began to avoid looking up at the steeple altogether, for it felt as though the birds were not merely watching but counting, measuring the town's breath in moments, preparing to record every detail for something older than God. And every time someone dared to look closer, they claimed the birds' eyes seemed glazed, as if reflecting not the sky but something red and moving from behind the glass. It wasn't long before a farmer's wife, determined to keep life ordinary, sent her eldest son to deliver milk to the convent's side door. He returned pale, shaking, his words spilling over themselves so quickly no one could follow. He claimed that though he pounded both fists against the door, no one answered, but he was certain he heard breathing, not one breath but many, all in perfect sync, as though the entire convent were alive and inhaling as a single being. By sunset that day, the boy had developed a fever, and by nightfall, he could speak only in numbers, counting to 14 over and over until his voice cracked and fell silent altogether. It was this moment that planted a deeper terror in the town. For 14 was not just a number, it was the same number of sisters believed to be locked inside the convent, the same number of figures Father Rena had glimpsed kneeling in that crimson light. People began to ask themselves the question no one wanted answered. If the sisters were praying behind locked doors, who or what were they praying to? And under the weight of that question, Breach Hollow began to fracture in quiet, imperceptible ways. The market fell silent, as though conversations were afraid to echo. Dogs refused to climb the hill, barking furiously at empty air. Children were pulled back from the chapel path, their mothers gripping small wrists so tightly that bruises bloomed like violets. And still the birds remained, a silent congregation, perched as if waiting for a sermon only they could hear. Because in Breach Hollow, silence wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was the sound of memory remembering you back. In Breach Hollow, dread did not simply stalk the edges of the chapel hill. It began to seep into blood and marrow, infecting the town like a silent plague whose symptoms were not measured in fever alone, but in memory twisting into something no longer entirely human. The farmer's son, the boy who had come back pale and breathless from the convent's side door, was the first to fall ill in a way that made the entire town hold its breath. By twilight, His skin burned so hot that the cool water his mother pressed to his brow hissed as though poured onto iron, and though his eyes stared wide and glassy, his lips kept moving, counting over and over to 14 as if locked in some forbidden prayer. It wasn't simply that he was sick, it was that he was reciting a number tied to the very heart of the chapel's mystery. The same number of sisters said to be locked behind that iron-bound door. Doctors were called, but they left as quickly as they arrived, muttering that this was no sickness they could name, that the boy's pulse beat in a rhythm unlike any mortal heart. Because in Breach Hollow, even a fever could become a hymn. Soon, others began to falter under the same strange malaise, though no two people suffered precisely alike. The butcher's apprentice woke screaming in the night, claiming that hymns were pouring from beneath her bed like water, each note thick with dust and a language no one recognized. When her parents burst into the room, they found her kneeling on the floorboards, hands clasped, eyes wide open, whispering words that the priest later insisted resembled a dialect once spoken in Carthage, a tongue never heard in this part of the world. And Clara Ara, the apprentice, who had never left the county, spoke of veiled women who visited her in dreams, teaching her prayers that burned like embers behind her eyelids. The sickness was never simply of the body. It was as though memory itself had grown infectious, leaping from person to person, rewriting the town's collective story, one delirious soul at a time. Merchants who once delivered flour and salt now kept their distance, eyes darting nervously to the ridge as if expecting the chapel to breathe its plague into the open air. Children awoke scratching words into their bed frames, verses from the Book of Tobit, though none of them could read, and mothers began burning bedsheets by the river rather than risk bringing such phrases back into their homes. It was not just fever that terrified Breach Hollow. It was the growing suspicion that the convent's silence was speaking through the sick, that each cough and shiver was a piece of some ritual no one had consented to join. Animals grew restless as well, cows refusing to approach their stalls, chickens refusing to lay eggs, dogs howling into empty corners. Even the wind seemed to blow with a different shape, carrying with it a bitter trace of sulfur, myrrh, and something else, a milky scent like dried breast milk, ancient and unnatural. The townspeople whispered that the convent's stones were breathing memory into the town, that the illnesses were not random, but steps in a ceremony older than scripture. Because in Breach Hollow, what spread from the chapel hill wasn't just disease, it was a reminder that faith could be twisted into contagion, that belief itself might become the carrier of something older and hungry. And each night, as darkness spilled across the cobblestones, more people confessed to hearing it a humming, low and steady, like an organ's final note played for no congregation still alive to hear it. No one could say where it came from, only that it seemed to pulse in time with the frightened beating of their own hearts. It was then that Breach Hollow realized the truth clawing at the edges of every whisper. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, the fear that once fluttered like a hidden thought soon began to take shape in timber and stone, revealing itself in the physical world as if the very town were being rewritten by invisible hands. The first true sign that the convent's silence was birthing something tangible came when the milk turned sour overnight, even in sealed clay jugs, curdling into pale lumps that smelled not of rot, but of something ancient and sweet, like myrrh mixed with old paper. The baker's bread, so reliable it had sustained generations, began collapsing in his ovens, falling inward as though air itself refused to rise. The blacksmith, a man of iron and fire, opened his shop one dawn to find every horseshoe in his forge bent into perfect crescents, untouched by hammer or heat, as though some cosmic hand had shaped them under starlight. Even he, a man not known for superstition, refused to approach the convent hill afterward, insisting the metal had been warmed to the touch, pulsing faintly under his fingertips as though alive. The hum grew louder now, no longer a whisper on the edge of hearing, but a steady vibration, threading through wooden beams and cobblestone streets. Merchants began tossing parcels toward the convent gate instead of delivering them, flinching as packages thudded against the stone archway, It wasn't fear of what might emerge from behind the door, it was fear of what might be waiting just on the other side, listening. Dogs refused to climb the slope, tails tucked, teeth bared at nothing but air. Horses whinnied and reared, eyes rolling white as if glimpsing shapes invisible to human sight. Children were forbidden to play anywhere near the hill, but even from town square. Mothers swore they could feel the convent watching them, pressing unseen eyes into the small of their backs. Because in Breach Hollow, it wasn't enough that terror hid in shadows, it wanted to change the world itself. The carpenter, emboldened by fear and curiosity, returned to the convent gates armed with chisels and crowbars, determined to breach the silence once and for all. But the hinges, rustless and cold, held fast as though fused to the stone itself. When he pressed his ear to the heavy wood, expecting to hear prayers or distant hymns, he heard instead a low hum so steady and deep it felt like an organ playing a note not meant for any living thing to hear. He staggered backward, pale and breathless, whispering that the door was warm beneath his hands, warm and breathing. The townsfolk began to realize that something fundamental was shifting. The door was no longer simply a door. Its texture had grown subtly different under torchlight. No longer the rough grain of timber, but a surface that seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding like lungs straining against ancient ribs. Because in Breach Hollow, wood was becoming flesh, and the boundary between the living and the inanimate was dissolving grain by grain. Even the town's clocks began to falter, their mechanisms stiff and reluctant, sometimes stalling at the same hour 3:17 before resuming with an eerie catch, as though struggling to keep time in a place no longer obeying earthly rules. The air itself felt thicker, tinged with a bitter tang of salt and iron, carrying distant whispers that might have been words, or might simply have been memory trying to crawl back into the world. Farmers found their wells running dry even after weeks of rain, and when they pulled the buckets up, the water smelled faintly of burning wax. And always, woven through every sound, was that hum, steady and indifferent, as though the chapel was tuning itself to a frequency beyond human comprehension. The townspeople tried to explain it away as disease, as coincidence, but each explanation fell apart in their mouths, leaving only silence and the knowledge that the convent door could only be locked from within. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror didn't just haunt people, it changed the shape of the world around them. And in every shiver of timber, in every crack of stone, one truth echoed beneath the town's breath. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. The longer the convent remained silent, the more the people of Breach Hollow felt as though their town was being watched from within its own memories, as if every brick and beam was suddenly aware of the secrets they thought long buried. It began with whispers, small, disjointed stories traded over barrels of flour and flickering lamplight, each one suggesting that the sisters of the convent had not merely vanished into silence, but had stepped into a ritual older than the faith that built those walls. Town council meetings, once loud with arguments about market prices and trade routes, became hushed gatherings where voices dropped to fearful murmurs at the mention of the chapel hill. Because in Breach Hollow, the most terrifying truths were the ones no one dared to speak above a whisper. Elas Maro, the stonemason, was the first to break the silence during a council meeting, his hands trembling as he recounted the memory he had kept hidden for years. A decade earlier, he'd been hired to repair the eastern wall of the convent after a minor landslide. While laying new stones near the prayer room, his chisel struck something hollow, a sealed iron panel etched with symbols that twisted the longer he stared, as if the metal itself were trying to teach him a new alphabet written in memory and fear. Mother Galilea, the convent's leader, had approached him without question, placed her cool palm against his chest, and whispered a psalm he'd never heard before. Then, she pressed more coins into his hand than the job was worth and told him to speak of it to no one. For 10 years, he obeyed, until the silence at the convent grew so loud it forced the truth from his throat. His story sent ripples through the room, as if the very air were listening. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, glancing at the door as though expecting someone or something to burst through and demand they swallow the secret back down. And as Ella spoke, the town realized that the convent's silence was not merely absence, it was a ritual in itself, a wall of secrecy built to contain something that pulsed beneath stone and memory. Because in Breach Hollow, memory was never harmless, it was a doorway, and some doors should never be remembered open. From that night on, the townsfolk began to confess small things, fragments of forgotten moments that suddenly rose to the surface like bones working free of soil. The blacksmith's wife admitted she'd seen lights flickering behind the chapel's stone walls. Not like candles, but like the glow of embers trapped beneath skin. The widow on the edge of town claimed that each night, just before sleep, she heard a voice neither male nor female, whispering, "Prepare the room." When she asked which room, the voice simply replied, "The room already sealed." Such confessions, once shared, seemed to poison the air around them. Those who spoke of their experiences often fell ill within days, racked by fevers and muttering fragments of psalms that no priest could place in any known scripture. And every time someone revealed a secret, the humming grew louder, as though the chapel itself was eavesdropping, hungry for each confession to fuel whatever ancient purpose it served. The town's identity began to fray as more people admitted to dreams of narrow hallways lined with veiled figures, each dream ending the same way, with a lock turning from the inside and footsteps that never reached the door. Because in Breach Hollow, silence was not emptiness, it was a memory waiting to be remembered. And under the weight of those whispers, one truth began to crystallize in every frightened heart. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. There comes a point in every true horror story when dread ceases to be a rumor and becomes architecture, a tangible shape pressing itself into brick, stone, and timber. And in Breach Hollow, that point arrived the moment the convent door began to change. What had once been sturdy oak, dark and grained with the patient lines of centuries, slowly began to pulse as though it held veins just beneath its surface, as though breath moved inside it, trapped and waiting for release. Those brave enough to approach the chapel claimed that, under torchlight, the door's wood now shimmered with a sheen not of varnish but of sweat, glistening faintly as if exhaling secrets from the skin of something no longer quite inanimate. The change spread outward from the door to the walls themselves, the limestone blocks shifting their color subtly from pale bone to an unsettling shade of ash gray, and the mortar lines between them seemed to tighten as though drawn together by some deep internal force. And by then, the people of Breach Hollow realized that the convent was no longer just a building, it was becoming a body. As if to confirm this new and horrifying truth, townsfolk began to speak of the shadows cast by the chapel walls at sunset. Normally, the sun would paint long, soft lines across the grass. But now those shadows seemed to cling to the ground, refusing to shift as the light changed, stretching longer and blacker than should have been possible. One afternoon, the blacksmith stood staring up at the chapel and swore that the steeple had grown taller, as though the building itself were reaching skyward, drawn upward by the weight of prayers never spoken. Others insisted that the shape of the chapel's roofline had become subtly distorted, warping as though the stones were bending under an invisible pressure. But perhaps the most chilling transformation of all was the way the convent's windows darkened from within. Where once stained glass glowed with crimson and gold, now only darkness pressed against the panes, a darkness so dense it seemed to push back against any light that tried to pierce it. And for those who dared to look closer, faint movements twitched behind the glass, flickers of forms that might have been human or might have been something far older, coiling and unfolding in a rhythm timed to that endless hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Because, in Breach Hollow, the true terror was never that the convent hid something monstrous, it was that the convent itself was becoming the monster. Even the stone steps leading to the chapel door began to show signs of transformation, growing slick and subtly warm to the touch, as though they were no longer carved from rock, but grown from living flesh. Farmers who ventured close enough to see the changes claimed they felt an odd resistance beneath their boots, as though the ground itself was drawing them in with each step, trying to fuse their footprints into its shifting surface. And the bell tower, once silent and stiff with dust, seemed to sway gently even on windless days, moving with a slow, deliberate pulse that mimicked the beating of a great heart. People began to whisper that the chapel hill was no longer merely a hill, it was a lung, breathing memory in and out. And all across Breach Hollow, walls inside homes began to warp, wooden beams curving in gentle arcs, as though the houses themselves were leaning toward the chapel, compelled by some gravitational pull born of worship and fear. The air grew thick with a smell like burnt linen and melted wax, a scent that clung to clothes and hair, refusing to wash away. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror was not content to remain behind closed doors, it reached outward, reshaping the world to match its own silent hymn. And in the hush between each pulse of the chapel's walls, one phrase echoed louder than any prayer. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. Even as stone and timber reshaped themselves around the chapel, an infection of another sort began to seep into the hearts and minds of Breach Hollow, a contagion not of plague, but of memory. As though the town itself was being recruited into a silent, forbidden cult. It began in dreams. One by one, the townspeople started waking with fragments of visions they could not explain, narrow hallways lit by wavering flame, walls lined with kneeling women hidden behind gauze veils, each of them motionless, yet somehow trembling in the air's heat. Every dream ended the same way, a metallic click of a lock turning from the inside, followed by footsteps approaching, yet never reaching the door. Those who awoke from such dreams often found themselves whispering phrases in languages they did not speak, clutching rosary beads so tightly that their palms bore perfect circles of bruised skin. The local priest tried to dismiss these collective visions as symptoms of mass hysteria. But as the days slipped further into darkness, the dreams grew more detailed and eerily synchronized. Clara Ara, the butcher's apprentice, began to mutter hymns in her sleep, words no one recognized, but which the priest later identified as bearing the cadence of a dialect once spoken in ancient Carthage. Clara Ara had never left the county, nor ever learned a foreign tongue. Yet when questioned about how she knew such words, she simply replied, "The women taught me." The blacksmith's wife confessed to her husband that she saw flickering lights each night behind the chapel walls. Not candlelight, but a pulse like something living beneath the stones, as if veins were beginning to glow. Meanwhile, the widow Harrow, whose eyes had grown cloudy with age, whispered that a voice spoke to her every evening before sleep, neither male nor female, telling her to prepare the room already sealed. These confessions, once shared, seemed to carry a dark price. Those who spoke their truths fell into fevers or silence, eyes distant, as though listening to something just out of mortal hearing. Because in Breach Hollow, speaking your secret was an invitation for something else to speak back. And while these strange testimonies spread through households like a chill breeze through shuttered windows, so too did symbols begin to appear across the town. Farmers turning their soil unearthed smooth tiles etched with twin circles, an eye closed over an eye open, laid in spirals pointing toward the chapel hill. One merchant found the symbol drawn in frost on his shop window, though no hand had traced it. It was as if the town itself was beginning to remember things it had never lived. Each pattern a fragment of some scripture older than any written word. And all the while, the humming grew louder, a constant undercurrent beneath the creak of floorboards and the sigh of wind through trees. It was neither music nor chant, but something deeper, a vibration felt in bone rather than heard by ear. Merchants began to speak of feeling watched even in their own homes, of shadows moving across walls where no light should fall. Doors that once closed flush against their frames now sat slightly ajar, as though waiting for someone to step through. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror was never content to stay in dreams, it demanded to become memory, to inscribe itself into the town's every gesture and breath. The memory cult, though unnamed, was now alive in every whispered conversation, every cautious glance toward the chapel hill. People began to suspect that silence itself had become scripture, that the sisters' vow of wordlessness was less about devotion than about containment. And in the growing quiet, one realization began to coil tighter around the town's collective throat. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow. As the months dragged forward under the weight of a silence so deep it seemed to possess mass, the decay that had once claimed bread and milk began to claw its way into the fabric of reality itself. The town was rotting from the inside out, not merely in wood and stone, but in memory and mind. It started with small things, a creak in the floorboards that repeated the same rhythm as the chapel's relentless hum, or wallpaper curling from the corners of rooms as if recoiling from unseen fingers. But soon, the signs grew bolder. One morning, townsfolk awoke to find that the entire east-facing wall of the widow Avery's house had turned 90 degrees overnight, so that her porch, once gazing toward sunrise, now stared west into the gathering dusk. When questioned, she insisted it had always been that way, even as her children wept, swearing they remembered the light spilling through the windows in golden morning rays. Because in Breach Hollow, the true horror was not that the world was changing, it was that memory itself was shifting to fit the changes. Clocks became useless, spinning forward and back as though time itself was undecided whether to flee or stay and witness. The blacksmith's forge glowed red at hours when no fire burned, and his tools appeared rusted black by dawn, despite fresh oil applied only hours earlier. Frost formed not only on windows but traced elaborate spirals on dinner plates, in loops of 14 lines coiling inward to a single dot at the center. Symbols no one remembered drawing. It was as though the town was being rewritten in a language of cold. Inside homes, plaster walls began to weep a thin, milky fluid that smelled faintly of myrrh and old pages. People found words rearranged in letters they received, prayers twisted into unfamiliar verses, and Bibles whose pages had grown blank as bone. Because in Breach Hollow, even the sacred was no longer safe from the hum's patient corruption. Children awoke with markings spiraling around their arms like bands of frostbite. Yet their skin remained unbroken and cold to the touch. One desperate father tried to carve the marks from his son's flesh, only to find that beneath the skin there was nothing but more frost. No blood, no wound, only the cold reaching deeper than flesh. And as the physical decay spread, so too did the fractures in the town's collective mind. People began speaking in riddles, weaving hymns with nonsense phrases, as though two voices were trying to speak through the same mouth. The postmaster was found hanging in his office, arms outstretched toward the east window, ink-stained fingers pointing as though to a horizon no one else could see. Beneath his chair, scratched into the floorboards, were the words, "We will all face east." In the blacksmith's home, the family discovered their rosary beads untangled and arranged in perfect circles each dawn, always missing the 14th bead, as though the house itself were remembering some ritual in the night. Merchants reported seeing shadows that did not belong to any human figure, drifting across their walls in the shape of veiled heads bowed in silent devotion. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror was not only that the town was dying, it was that it was being carefully, deliberately remade. The earth near the chapel seemed to breathe underfoot, the soil sinking and rising as though pulled by a slow, monstrous lung. The chapel itself loomed taller each day, casting a shadow that no longer shifted with the sun. And through it all ran the steady hum, growing louder, yet never rising in pitch, pressing into the marrow of every bone until sleep became impossible, until waking felt like drowning in air that carried the faint taste of old prayers. And in that hum, one message pulsed relentlessly through every warped wall and every trembling heart. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, there came a night when the silence that had held the chapel hill in its grip for weeks finally shuddered, like breath drawn too deeply. and with it, the door of the convent, which had remained sealed as though stitched shut by faith and fear alike, began to move. It was not a sudden swing or violent break, but the slow, deliberate yielding of something alive. A groan of old hinges giving way to a will older than any carpenter's chisel. The crack was barely an inch wide, yet from that narrow darkness spilled a single exhale of air, warm and strangely sweet, scented with wax, salt, and cedar aged beyond human memory. People who lived close enough to hear it swore they felt the hum deepen, as though the chapel was taking its first true breath in decades. Word spread fast through the town, moving like lightning through dry wood. The convent door, the one believed to be no longer wood at all, had shifted. It was as though Breach Hollow itself exhaled with the news, trembling under the weight of a question no one dared speak aloud. If the door was opening, who or what was opening it? From that night forward, the chapel seemed to lean into the town's collective vision, no longer content to sit perched on its ridge like a silent witness. The crack in the door remained, just wide enough to catch the flicker of shadows moving behind it, as if something was pacing the chapel floor, waiting for the right moment to step across a boundary, etched, not in stone, but in memory. Because in Breach Hollow, thresholds were never just wood and iron, they were promises. And promises remembered were the most dangerous of all. The watchers arrived soon after, without announcement or explanation. 14 figures who appeared overnight, standing silent and still around the chapel's perimeter. They wore no habits, no recognizable uniform, only garments that seemed sewn from parchment inscribed with faded scripture, their hems lined in delicate, inky verses that no one could read without feeling the urge to weep. Each bore a rosary of 13 beads, with the 14th held loose, dangling like a question yet to be answered. And though no faces were visible beneath their veils, some townsfolk whispered that if you stood close enough, you could hear them breathing, not like lungs drawing air, but like wind sifting through hollow stone corridors. The presence of the watchers carried a weight that pressed on every chest in Breach Hollow, as though they were not simply guards, but memories made flesh, here to ensure the ritual continued. Because in Breach Hollow, even silence had an audience. As the days passed, the chapel door pulsed faintly, shifting in rhythm with the watchers' silent vigil. Windows across the town began to fog from the inside, revealing fleeting glimpses of rooms that were not the town's own. Hints of vaulted ceilings and candle flames wavering in a draftless darkness. And all the while, the humming wove through the town like a needle stitching reality together and pulling it apart in the same motion. It seemed to come not just from the chapel, but from the very air people breathed, from beneath floorboards, from behind the walls where no echo should reach. Merchants abandoned their shops at dusk, unwilling to be caught outdoors should the watchers turn their veiled heads. Mothers kept children inside, terrified they might begin tracing circles on the window panes, and under every anxious breath lay a single, suffocating certainty. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, as the year bent toward its final, frost-bitten weeks, it seemed as though the town itself held its breath, caught in the tightening pause before a final note in a hymn too ancient for mortal throats. For on the first night of December, the convent door opened not wide, not enough for any figure to pass, but just enough to split the silence like a wound tearing through flesh. It was an opening that hummed with promise and dread, a narrow slit that exhaled a single breath of warm air carrying scents so foreign and yet so familiar. Salt, wax, and cedar laced with the faint, metallic trace of old blood. Those who stood close enough said they felt the heat on their faces, as though the chapel itself had become a living thing exhaling secrets from the dark. And from that moment, the town was no longer simply waiting to see what lay behind the door. It was being drawn toward it, as if the chapel had become a magnet for every unspoken fear the townspeople had tried to bury. Houses that had stood firm for generations began to tilt imperceptibly toward the ridge, floorboards groaning under weightless pressure. Window panes bowed inward, trembling as though listening for a voice that might slip through the narrow crack in the convent door. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror was not that the door opened, it was that the town yearned for what might emerge. The watchers, ever silent, turned in perfect unison each evening, veiled faces now facing inward toward the chapel. And on the seventh night after the door cracked, they knelt, palms raised, as though offering themselves to something only they could see. That same night, the town's clocks failed entirely, hands spinning forward, backward, then shattering inward as if time itself could no longer bear witness to what was coming. It was then that the humming changed. It rose, higher than it ever had, until it passed the range of hearing, vibrating instead in the cavities of the chest and behind the eyes, as though each person was being tuned to a new frequency. The blacksmith, who had once tried to banish the sound with hammering steel, stood in the street clutching his ears, whispering that the chapel door was speaking names he recognized but had never spoken aloud. Elsewhere, children were found tracing circles into the frost-covered earth, murmuring the phrase she almost remembers. Do not stop humming. Because in Breach Hollow, memory was no longer something carried quietly in the mind. It had become a living force demanding to be remembered aloud. The chapel itself appeared taller now, its steeple gone, replaced by a slow spiral of mist that churned above it like a beckoning finger. No wind stirred it. No sun dissolved it. Instead, it hovered as if waiting for permission to descend. And in the square, those who remained began to whisper that the door was not merely a passage but an invitation, a wound that had waited centuries to reopen. It was then, at the hour once known as 3:17, that a deep, wet knocking began from beneath the chapel hill. Not an echo, not the tap of stone on stone, but the sound of something alive remembering how to ask to be let in. 14 knocks. Silence. 14 knocks. Silence. Over and over. As if counting down toward a revelation that no human was meant to survive. The final terror came when people realized that they, too, were starting to hum. Not by choice, but as an involuntary answer to the pulsing resonance filling every street and hollow. Even those who tried to pray found their words dissolving into a rhythm not their own. Because in Breach Hollow, the horror was never just behind the door, it was that the town had become part of the ritual. And beneath the stars, veiled by colorless snow, one truth bloomed like frost across every window pane. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, the dawn after the door cracked open was not a return to sunlight and safety, but a pale imitation of morning that seemed to hang like a veil over a town forever changed. Because in Breach Hollow, true horror never leaves, it lingers, patient and hungry, breathing beneath floorboards and drifting through quiet rooms like a memory too heavy to forget. The chapel door, though open only a sliver, never swung wider nor closed again. Instead, it remained in that state of half-invitation, a wound in the world's skin that neither healed nor bled. People stopped approaching it altogether, unwilling to risk hearing the slow, wet knocking that pulsed from beneath the hill each night. And yet, though no one dared draw closer, every soul in Breach Hollow felt themselves leaning toward it, as if the chapel had become a silent star, tugging them into its gravity. Even the buildings seemed to bow subtly in that direction. Roof lines sagged. Foundations shifted imperceptibly toward the ridge. It was as though the entire town was bending into the shape of a single, terrible prayer. The watchers remained, 14 figures silent as ever, still draped in linen inked with scripture, unmoving, except for a slight sway that matched the chapel's hum. No one had seen them arrive, and no one ever saw them leave. But in the weeks that followed, townsfolk noticed their number sometimes appeared to change: 14 one day, 13 the next, only to be 14 again by dusk. As though the watchers were not merely sentinels, but participants in a ritual that required absence as much as presence. Merchants abandoned shops mid-transaction, leaving scales unbalanced and coins scattered like seeds across counters. The butcher's knives rusted overnight, even as the windows in his shop clouded with frost from the inside, tracing loops of scripture no one could decipher. The blacksmith's forge grew cold and would not relight, no matter how many sparks he coaxed from the bellows. Because in Breach Hollow, the aftermath of horror is not silence, it is everything continuing as if nothing has changed, while knowing deep inside that everything has. People who tried to leave the town found their paths inexplicably turning them back, their wagons circling the ridge again and again until wheels broke and horses refused to pull forward. Even letters sent to distant bishops and magistrates were returned. The ink warped into strange glyphs, as though the very words had become infected by the hum. It was not that the town could not leave Breach Hollow, it was that Breach Hollow would not let go. And while no new miracles or monstrosities burst forth from the convent's narrow door, the signs of the lingering presence grew more subtle and more terrifying. Infants, among the few still born in the village, sometimes arrived humming before they could cry, their tiny chests vibrating in a cadence matching the chapel's ceaseless pulse. At night, even the snow fell in silence so profound it felt as though each flake was listening, remembering the names no longer spoken aloud. Windows fogged in patterns of circles and eyes, and each dawn seemed dimmer than the one before, as though the sun itself was reluctant to rise over a town it no longer recognized. The old town scribe, Henry Mott, who had tried to transcribe the return hymn weeks prior, wandered the streets tracing spirals in the air with his finger, his eyes vacant, his lips whispering, "The stones are singing again." And always, beneath every cough, every prayer, every shuffle of weary footsteps, the townspeople felt the same low hum pressing into the hollows behind their ribs, filling the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Because in Breach Hollow, the truest horror is not what waits behind a door. It is that once you've heard the hum, you belong to it forever. And in that endless echo, one certainty continued to pulse like a second heartbeat through every soul left standing. They weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, what remained after the door cracked open was not merely silence, nor merely fear. It was the understanding that they had brushed against the edge of something too vast for human comprehension, something that had waited centuries to be remembered. Because in Breach Hollow, the true horror was never that something hid behind the door. It was that the door was only the beginning. The chapel still stands, or rather, the empty space where the door once was. A hollow arch that breathes like an open wound in the fabric of the town. It pulses gently in the chill dawn light, as though sighing through centuries of secrets. The watchers remain, though fewer now, and some nights none at all. It's as though they have moved inside the town itself, inhabiting shadows, reflections, the hush between footsteps on winter cobblestones. People rarely speak of the convent anymore. It's not that they've forgotten, but that remembering has become too dangerous. Words twist in the mouth. Prayers change mid-sentence into unfamiliar syllables, and eyes widen with recognition of things no tongue should ever shape. The innkeeper's wife, who once fell into a trance whispering verses from Revelation, now sits silent beside her hearth, sewing endless rows of tiny circles into blankets, her thread black as soot. She doesn't speak, but sometimes, in the crackle of the fire, those circles seem to hum. Children still wake, crying in the night, clawing at the air as though something invisible hovers just inches from their faces. Some draw spirals in the frost on windows, each loop ending in a single, trembling dot. And more than once, Parents have found their children standing barefoot in the snow at dawn, whispering. She almost remembers. Don't stop humming. Because in Breach Hollow, the memory was never simply human recollection. It was a living force, bending reality, rewriting walls, and bleeding into the marrow of those who stayed. The farmers who once tilled soil now avoid certain fields where the ground remains bare, no matter how many seeds they cast. Beneath those fields lie smooth tiles etched with twin eye symbols, uncovered by the plow and swiftly covered again in salt and soil, as if the earth itself knows some truths are too heavy to be exposed to daylight. And though no one admits it aloud, they all understand one thing. The chapel door did not open for them. It opened to them. The mail never comes anymore. Letters vanish into the ridges, or arrive blank, or return scrawled with phrases like, "She is awake," written in a trembling charcoal hand that smells faintly of myrrh and burnt paper. Because in Breach Hollow, even ink has learned to remember. Travelers sometimes pass through, lured by tales of the town where the convent became flesh, eager for a glimpse of true horror, of real haunted places where unsolved mysteries still breathe. But they leave pale, silent, unwilling to speak of what they glimpsed behind the chapel's blackened windows, and some don't leave at all. The town has grown quieter than ever. The market square, once echoing with hammer strikes and laughter, now sits empty beneath the swirling pale snow. No new names appear in the baptismal register, and no mass has been said for months. The blacksmith's forge is cold, the baker's ovens still, and beneath it all, the hum persists, soft yet inexorable, as though time itself has decided that this small place on the edge of nowhere is where all its secrets should pool and settle. Because in Breach Hollow, the truest horror is that the story has not ended, it is only pausing, waiting for the next chapter to be remembered. And if you ask the few who still remain why they don't leave, why they endure the frost and the humming and the half-seen shadows, they'll lower their eyes and say simply, they weren't waiting for God. They were waiting for something older. In Breach Hollow, the story did not end with the door cracked open, nor with the watchers fading into the snowfall. Instead, it settled like dust into the rafters, into the pores of the wood, into the marrow of every person who remained behind. Because in Breach Hollow, the truest horror is that nothing ever truly ends. It merely waits for someone to remember it again. The chapel door is gone now, not destroyed, not broken, simply gone. In its place yawns a hollow archway that seems to pulse gently, as though exhaling memories rather than air. Some nights, villagers swear they see faint lights spiraling in its depths, the suggestion of stairs descending into a space that does not belong to the earth. Those who dare to approach the threshold find that sound disappears the closer they come, swallowed into a hush so deep it feels like standing underwater, listening to a heartbeat older than any human record. And though the watchers no longer stand vigil outside, they have not truly vanished. Instead, people glimpse them now in reflections, in the quick darting shadows that slip across the frost-glazed windows at twilight. The town's few remaining children claim that sometimes the watchers whisper to them in the dark, not in threats, but in invitations. Because in Breach Hollow, the warning is not always to flee, it is sometimes to come closer. It is this terrible magnetism that haunts the town more than any visible horror. The knowledge that the door did not open for destruction, but as an invitation to remember, to step inside, to kneel. And the townspeople know, deep in the places where prayers turned sour, that memory itself has become a kind of ritual, a living force demanding participation. Merchants who once sold flour and salt have boarded their shops, unwilling to endure the constant scratching noises that echo from beneath the floorboards each night, as though unseen quills are writing messages into the wood. The blacksmith's hammer lies cold and silent on his anvil, for he refuses to work metal that might pulse beneath his fingers. Because in Breach Hollow, even iron is no longer entirely iron, it might be something remembering how to become flesh. The town scribe, Henry Mott, who once tried to document the hymn pouring through his mind, walks the streets in silence now, his head tilted as if listening to words only he can hear. And sometimes, he presses his palm against the stone walls of buildings and whispers, "It's still moving under there." The snow keeps falling, but it does not melt on rooftops or windows. It remains heavy, layered like old parchment, each flake landing with a weight far greater than its size. In the stillness of these nights, some claim to hear the earth beneath the chapel hill shifting, as if something vast is coiling itself tighter, waiting for a moment to unfurl. Because in Breach Hollow, the ground does not merely hold history, it remembers it, and it knows your name. And so the town waits. Shops remain closed. Churches echo empty. Meals are eaten in silence. And always, the hum persists, a sound no longer external, but woven into breath, into thought, into the rhythm of blood moving through veins. And in that hum lies the final warning. She hasn't found you yet. She's letting you remember first. So tonight, if your house creaks a little too rhythmically, if the shadows in the corner of your eye seem to stand a little straighter, remember this. In Breach Hollow, the true horror was never what waited behind the door. It was the silence that lets you believe you're safe. Because in every forgotten town, in every empty chapel, in every sliver of darkness between your footsteps, something might be waiting, not to hurt you, but to make you remember. And here's the truth that no horror story tells you outright. The monsters we fear the most are the ones we give shape with our own memory. What you carry home from this tale, whether it haunts you or leaves you curious, is yours to decide. But if you felt even the slightest chill tonight, if a single sentence from Breach Hollow lodged itself behind your ribs, then I want you to do something right now. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you fear remembering. Because sometimes the only way to keep the door closed is to share what's on the other side. Save this video, share it, and hit subscribe so the next time we peel back the veil on the world's hidden horrors, you'll be the first to know. Until then, keep your mirrors covered, your names quiet, and your doors locked from the inside. Good night.